The Home Department. Liz Twist.
Question 1, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The UK has a long and proud tradition of offering protection to vulnerable people fleeing war and persecution, and this government takes the welfare of vulnerable children extremely serious. We support the principle of family unity wholeheartedly.
Liz Twist.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. If the government is as committed as it says to maintaining the ability for children to join family members in the UK, as ministers have repeatedly said, then rather than wait for the outcome of negotiations, will the Home Office not get on the front foot and make some much-needed changes to domestic legislation? You could make the changes tomorrow and provide certainty for many hundreds of people who are currently are able to be reunited through the Dublin regulation.
Well said, Liz.
Well, the Honourable Lady will be more than aware in terms of the work that we do to provide safe and legal routes with regards to family reunion and vulnerable persons and children. And you've already heard me say that we are fully committed to supporting the most vulnerable children and the principle of family reunion. It is a fact that we are about to negotiate with the European Union. I have been clear, and in fact I set out our position of this government in communications and correspondence with the European Commission at the end of last year, and that is the route we'll be pursuing.
And the Home Secretary, Diana.
The Home Secretary will be aware of the conditions many of these refugee children endure in refugee camps all over Europe. She will also be aware that the public does not want us to let these children down. And will the Home Secretary confirm that unless law and practice is changed, we run the risk of breaking up families and leaving children abandoned with no relative to care for them?
Well, can I thank the Honourable Lady for her remarks? And in fact, she has touched on a very important point, which is the conditions that children and families endure in refugee camps outside of the United Kingdom. And that could be in Europe, but also countries outside of Europe as well. I think, first of all, Mr Speaker, it's important that we reflect about the priorities and the standards that we as a country give to those refugees through much of the work that we do actually through international development and aid. But I think we should not overlook the fact that there are a great deal of other associated issues with regards to reunion, the protection of refugees, their settlement and vulnerable children that come together, yes, internationally, but we are also leading the way on this within the UK.
Ray.
The Home Secretary will agree with me that by far the best way of reuniting families is finding vulnerable children in refugee camps in Syria and Afghanistan and elsewhere. And simply accepting those who turn up at Dover risks encouraging the vicious people traffickers who thereby make a lot of money out of it. And would she aware of the, no less the Archbishop of Canterbury, who said recently, the resettlement of thousands of the world's most vulnerable refugees over the past 4 years is something the UK can be proud of. I hope she's proud of it.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his comments. We have a proud record, and I think this House should be under no illusions, a very strong and proud record of helping vulnerable children, and we have protected over 41,000 since the start of 2010. But he is right, Mr Speaker, there are a number of points here about the criminality that is associated with illegal migration, and I'm afraid we've seen far too much of that, whether it's through small boats or through lorry vehicle movements as well, where people are trafficked, and of course that is wrong, and that is something we are also determined to stamp out.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree that given the government's action that they're taking to protect vulnerable children through legal routes, that actually more action needs to be taken to slow down and stop the illegal people trafficking routes, particularly those between Calais and Dover?
The honourable member for Dover speaks with a great deal of knowledge and insight about this issue, and this is the point. We must absolutely clamp down on the illegal routes, many of which are upstream, they are outside of the United Kingdom, that are being exploited, and the appalling amount of human trafficking that is taking place. There are many safe legal routes, Mr Speaker, ones that are supported by the British Government, and we will continue to support those.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Speaker, why don't we simply unilaterally say that we will continue to consider take-charge requests on behalf of unaccompanied children from Europe? Why should these rights, the rights of children, be subject to negotiations at all?
Well, I think the Honourable Gentleman must recognise, of course, that any future agreement is a matter of negotiation, and it's not just within the gift of the United Kingdom alone. We can work bilaterally, but of course, the point is this is about the reciprocal arrangements that we actually undertake with our fellow EU counterparts, and that is the right approach that has been outlined by the government.
Virginia Crosby.
Question 2, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And with permission, I will answer question 2 along with questions 8 and 14. Terrorists are a persistent menace to our security and our way of life. The nature of the terrorist threat is constantly changing, and therefore so must our response evolve as well. The safety and security of the UK is obviously our #1 priority, and we are committed to ensuring that our security and law enforcement organisations have the powers and the tools they need to keep us safe. To do this, we have provided an additional £160 million for counter-terrorism policing this year, taking counter-terrorism police funding to over £800 million. And the Counter-Terrorism and Sentencing Bill and our emergency legislation will close further gaps in our ability to combat terrorism.
Virginia Crosby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Reports suggest that the perpetrator of the recent London terror attack was on automatic early release. Does the Minister agree with me that we need a robust and tough approach to sentencing for those convicted of terror offences to prevent them from being able to carry out further atrocities?
Yes, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and that's why this government will be introducing emergency legislation in Parliament tomorrow that will end the automatic early release of terrorist offenders without first there being a thorough risk assessment done by the Parole Board. Those considered still a threat to public safety will be forced to spend the rest of their time in prison. These changes will mean around 50 terrorist prisoners already serving effective sentences will see their automatic release halted. We will not hesitate to take decisive action to ensure we do all we can to protect the public and keep our streets safe.
Russell.
Can my right honourable friend update the House on steps his department is taking to ensure those who are released from prison at the end of terrorism-related offences face the most stringent and monitoring and reporting requirements?
Absolutely, Mr Speaker, and I'm pleased to say to the honourable gentleman, my honourable friend, that last week we announced that we are considering whether new legislation is required to provide additional reassurance when the terrorist offenders are released from prison. There are a range of measures available, including stringent conditions during post-release licence periods, notification requirements for terrorist offenders, which only last year the government has already strengthened. Serious crime prevention orders were extended to terrorist offenders last year, and they provide the police with strengthened powers to manage terrorists on their release, along with terrorism prevention and investigation measures. And as I say, we will continue to review everything to make sure we're doing everything we can to keep the public safe.
Gareth Davies.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Countering terrorism is not just about London and the big cities, but is across the whole country. Can I welcome the extra £8.6 million of funding for Lincolnshire Police and ask what can be done to prevent people in rural areas from being drawn into terrorist activity going forward? Thank you.
My honourable friend makes a good point. Funding overall for CT policing will grow to £906 million in 2020 to 2021. That's a £90 million year-on-year increase, and that money will support and maintain the record high numbers of ongoing counter-terrorism policing investigations, allowing us to respond swiftly and decisively to incidents, no matter where they take place, and we have to be clear this could be anywhere in the UK. That is a significant additional investment, but it also builds on the work we are doing with the 20,000 extra police officers around the country to make sure we're protecting our communities, and the work we do in all communities around the country with the Prevent programme to keep people safe and prevent people being taken into extremism in the first place.
Thomas Simmons.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And the Minister has just referred to the Prevent programme, and this week it is a year since the Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Bill received its royal assent. And of course in that act was an independent review of the Prevent programme. In the last year, the government has appointed one reviewer who's had to resign from post given previous views he'd expressed about Prevent, and we are left today, a year later, without a reviewer in place. The Minister is talking about decisive action. When will that reviewer be appointed?
As I was saying to the honourable gentleman, as I've outlined in this dispatch box before, the review will go ahead. The review will be completed in the time frame the government outlined, which was to be done before the end of August this year. That is still the case, and we are introducing emergency legislation tomorrow.
Dim Doiter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We face a growing threat from extreme right-wing organisations in this country as well. You'll be aware of the incidents in my own communities from extreme right-wing groups. Why has the government therefore not yet prescribed organisations like System Resistance Network, Sonnenkrieg Division and others who are linked to the banned National Action Organisation? And what steps will the government take to review this situation urgently?
Well, these issues are always under review, and I would just say the honourable gentleman is right. Extremism from any direction is something we have to be alert to and aware of, and growth in extremism on the right wing is an important thing, and it's why preventing it as a programme in itself is focused on protecting those people who are targeted by terrorist recruiters, regardless of the reasoning from where they come from.
Very Sherman.
Speaker, surely we should have a programme giving young people who might be attracted into terrorism other things, creative things to do in the community. Would he just think about using some of this and tens of millions flowing from the plastic bags charge to divert it into community action that would involve young people and replace some of the dreadful cuts in youth services we've had in recent years?
Well, I'd say to you, he's absolutely right about engaging with people from communities across the country, particularly young people. We do have funds specifically focused on young people, and I would also just say one of the areas where Prevent is so successful, the Prevent training itself has already completed some 1.1 million times. It's enabled frontline practitioners, including teachers, to recognise the signs of radicalisation. It's why this programme is so important, as well as the bespoke programmes that we support.
Durham Henry.
Question 3, Mr. Speaker.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to group this question with questions 11, 13, 15 and 19. The government is committed to delivering on the people's priorities by tackling violent crime. We have already invested £220 million in early intervention, and through our Serious Violence Fund, we've committed to funding violence reduction units until 2021. And we're introducing the Serious Violence Bill, which will put a duty on police, councils and other agencies to prevent and reduce serious violence.
Henry.
Mr. Speaker, ahead of the Police and Crime Commissioner elections in May, will my right honourable friend encourage our fantastic Conservative candidates to make youth diversion schemes a key part of their manifestos?
Well, may I thank my honourable friend for reminding the entire House that we do have these vitally crucial elections coming towards us, where the public will have the right to hold their police and crime commissioners to account, and I look forward to working with many Conservative PCCs in the future, I hope. But I am fully supportive of the idea of diverting children who are on the cusp of entering the justice system and to put in place, where appropriate, support which can reduce risk and prevent an escalation in offending. He may wish to know that in his own local area we are funding Red Thread at the Queen's Medical Centre. I was delighted to attend their launch last year, and through the Youth Endowment Fund, 2 different projects are helping children, young people, their families and schools to keep them safe and divert them from risk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Children excluded from school are twice as likely to carry a knife, and a quarter of young offenders who are serving a custodial sentence of less than 12 months have a history of permanent exclusion. To help turn around the life chances of these children, will my honourable friend take up the recommendations in my report of school exclusion published last year that aims to take a public health approach to crime and designed to tackle the root causes, not just the symptoms, of school disengagement?
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and indeed for his work that he did, his meticulous work in his report. He will know that the Prime Minister is taking charge of our response to serious violence, and indeed is holding a Cabinet subcommittee on this imminently. I agree with him that we must tackle the root causes of serious violence, and that is precisely why we're bringing the Serious Violence Bill forward, to place a duty on the agencies that can help address this.
Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I fully support the exclusions review that was just referred to. But in tackling youth violence, does the Home Office think it's either acceptable or right that the vast majority of young people on the gang matrix are from BME backgrounds? Being flagged on the gang matrix brings with it huge consequences for those young people, often separation from families and other issues. Does she think this is either appropriate or that this approach works?
Well, of course, the Honourable Lady is referring to an operational tool used by the police, but it is one of many tools that we are looking at in terms of law enforcement response and the crucial issues we're talking about here about diverting children and young people away from crime in the first place. The causes are manifold, and we must work as communities to address them together.
Sir David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my honourable friend assure me the police have all the powers they need to crack down on the scourge of knife crime, which is ruining so many lives across the country, but particularly in London? And could she update the House on plans she has to target repeat knife crime carriers?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, who, of course, brings his experience of representing his constituency on this important issue into the House. We're determined to ensure that the police have the powers they need to tackle this terrible scourge. And this is why, in the new Serious Violence Bill, a new court order will be brought forward that will make it easier for the police to stop and search known and convicted knife carriers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What is she doing to protect young and vulnerable people from drugs gangs, particularly in rural areas like mine, where they are extremely prevalent, and how can we help protect them?
Minister.
Drug gangs, or indeed county lines, often involve a horrific form of child criminal exploitation, and we're determined to put an end to it. One of the many ways we're seeking to do this is through further investment in the National County Lines Coordination Centre, which has coordinated enforcement action across the country, resulting in more than 2,500 arrests and the safeguarding of more than 3,000 vulnerable people.
Louise Head.
Mr. Speaker, last year Labour attempted to amend the Offensive Weapons Bill to ban the open sale of knives and require shops to lock them behind cabinets, as we currently require them to do for cigarettes. The government refused those amendments. Last week, Sudesh Aman walked into a shop on Streatham High Street, picked up a knife from the display and stabbed 2 people. This weekend, that shop was still openly displaying knives and machetes by the front door. Will the government now think again?
Well, the Honourable Lady may recall that we said we would keep it under review because the measures that were put forward in the bill last year were of a nature that we felt didn't target those areas that have a particular problem with knife crime. We will keep it under review, but I make the point again that it is, of course, the responsibility of shop owners to make sure that if they're selling items like that, then they display them appropriately and, if necessary, keep them under lock and key.
Alex Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good youth services are the front line against youth violence, but this week we see yet another local government settlement that means there's a decade's worth of erosion on funding for youth services. What are the Home Office going to do differently to encourage DCLG to properly fund youth services, or to put their own money in to a good universal offer across all of our communities?
Well, the honourable gentleman will know of the most recent local authority grants, which indeed the House is debating later this week. But he will also know that the Chancellor reinstated a commitment to young people, confirming £500 million of investment through the new Youth Investment Fund over 5 years, in addition to the £220 million that will be spent over the next 10 years looking at early intervention projects that can, and I hope really will, make a great difference to our young people's lives.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Scottish Government's Cashback for Community scheme is about to make a payment of £19 million of money recovered under the proceeds of crime to youth projects in Scotland, bringing total payments to over £110 million since the programme began in 2008. Will she join me in welcoming this as something which can deliver real opportunity for young people in Scotland?
Mr. Speaker, as always, I will work with anyone, commend anyone who is joining the government's determination to cut down on violent crime and to protect our young people.
Fiona Bruce.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, it is often forgotten or taken for granted by many that behind every police officer stands a proud but anxious family. We want to recognise their bravery, commitment and sacrifice by introducing the Police Covenant. The Covenant, which will be brought forward through the Police Powers of Protection Bill, places it on a statutory footing and ensuring Parliament can scrutinise its progress, and we will be launching a consultation on the principle and scope of the Covenant in coming weeks.
Fiona Bruce.
What steps are ministers taking to ensure that families who lose a loved one in the line of duty, such as the family of PC Andrew Harper, who was tragically killed last year, receive the support they need?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady raises an extremely important point, and obviously the death of Andrew Harper last year on the very edge of my constituency was a terrible and tragic event. She will know that there are already matters in place to assist families in that position, not least the Police Injury Benefit Scheme, and indeed welfare support offered by particular forces and the Police Federation themselves. But there is always more that we can do, and we would welcome submissions into the consultation on the Covenant to address any gaps that may be there.
Chris Bryan.
One of the things that families would quite like to see is if the prosecuting authorities and the police themselves took it much more seriously when there are assaults on police officers, even if they are relatively minor ones, because otherwise there seems to be a sort of acceptance that a degree of violence is in the day job of being a police officer, and that must surely be wrong. Why is it still not true that the legislation that was introduced 2 years ago is not being used effectively by the Crown Prosecution Service?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman raises an extremely important point, and I've said in this House before, it's my view that anybody who raises a malevolent finger against any emergency service should face the full weight of the law. He is right that there is general concern about the increasing number of attacks on emergency service workers of all types, and we will be reviewing what steps need to be taken in the near future to sort that out.
Seeley. Question 5, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the government's pledge to put an additional 20,000 officers on our streets sends a clear message that we're committed to giving police the resources they need to tackle the scourge of crime. Hampshire will receive up to £366.5 million of funding next year, an increase of up to £26.1 million on the previous year. In this year alone, the county will benefit from 156 more police officers.
Bob Seeley.
I welcome the increase to Hampshire and Isle of Wight Constabulary. Will he agree that the increase will enable police, both in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight and other areas of the UK, to follow up lower-level crime, which causes great concern to all our constituents, but has, in recent years, the police have been under pressure not to investigate due to police numbers?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's obviously an operational matter for Chief Constables to address where and how they allocate their resources, but I would certainly hope that an increase in the number of police officers will allow them to spend more time on the sort of crime that assail both his community and mine in the county, which perhaps don't attract the attention of the headlines, but nevertheless cause consternation in the communities we represent.
Stephen Flynn.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
Immigration is and will remain a reserved matter. This government will introduce a points-based immigration system which works in the interests of the whole of the United Kingdom, including Scotland. Applying different immigration rules to different parts of the UK would significantly complicate the immigration system.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Australian Immigration Minister stated in November last year that regional visas can play an important role in helping to address regional skills gaps and grow local economies. As migration is the only reason Scotland's population continues to grow, does the Minister agree that Scotland would benefit from this Australian approach to immigration, rather than the one-size-fits-all role of this UK government?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, we've asked the Independent Migration Advisory Committee on several occasions to look at the case around applying different immigration arrangements to different areas of the UK. They have consistently recommended against this, and I think members in this House will realise why it would make no sense, for example, a plumber from Gretna to be unable to take on jobs in Carlisle.
Joanna Church.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. New Zealand, Switzerland and Canada are just some of the other countries who, like Australia, operate a tailored regional immigration system without any need for internal borders. So what possible rationale is there for claiming, as the Prime Minister did last week, that to operate a Scottish visa would require a hard border between Scotland and England?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, we'd make very clear the Independent Migration Advisory Committee has set out in their report why they do not recommend this type of approach. And ultimately, Mr. Speaker, we don't want to see borders at Berwick just to satisfy a separatist obsession. And our goal will be to have a system that works and drives success in Scotland. And that means being part of a wider, stronger United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the only people satisfying a separatist obsession at the moment are the benches opposite with their hard Brexit. But let's try again on this mythical hard border, shall we? The United Kingdom has an open land border and shares a common travel area with the Republic of Ireland, which is a country that operates an entirely distinct and independent system. It doesn't necessitate a hard border. So why should a modest Scottish visa mean a hard border between England and Scotland? Let's have an answer to the question for a change.
Well, let's be very clear. The Migration Advisory Committee has advised against such a system. It would create complexity in terms of businesses having to work out which staff were on one visa and which were on another. And ultimately, we will be guided by independent advice. But I'll be absolutely clear, this government will be listening to creating a migration system that will work for Scotland, will drive success in Scotland, but will not drive separation for Scotland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister confirm that this government will indeed design and implement a new, fit-for-purpose global immigration system that works for all regions and nations of our United Kingdom? And of course, members on the SNP benches opposite have as much right as any member in this place to work with the government to help achieve this.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, absolutely. And, the suggestion from the Scottish Government that it be implemented via the Scottish Tax Code is rather defeated by the fact that, of course, Scottish members of Parliament are on the Scottish Tax Code but work across our United Kingdom, and rightly so. So, yes, we will be working with interest groups across Scotland to make sure this system works for Scotland as part of our United Kingdom based on a points base. And, again, we will be focused on what works and what is successful, not on what pleases the separatist grievance agenda.
Cat Smith.
Question 7.
Mr. Speaker, we believe that the entire country, including Lancashire, could do with a boost in police numbers to address the changing nature of crime, and as a result we've provided enough money to recruit 6,000 police officers over the next year. Of that, Lancashire will benefit from 153 more.
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure you'll wish to join with me in paying tribute to Lancashire Police, who responded over the weekend to the devastating effects of Storm Ciara alongside all the other emergency services. The Minister points out that Lancashire are to receive 153 officers under this core grant allocation tile funding, but Lancashire lost 750 police officers since 2010, and on that pattern we will not regain the total number of officers lost, whereas Surrey, who lost 8 officers since 2010, look to be gaining hundreds of officers under this funding formula. Can he explain to my constituents why this is fair?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the funding formula has been in place for some time, and there's obviously consternation across the House about the impact that it may have, along with a number of the other formulas on which we allocate resources. We obviously keep it under review, and we'll be doing so on this formula. But for the moment, the quickest and most efficacious way for us to share out this huge uplift in the number of police officers across the country was using the existing formula, and I hope those 153 officers will be put to good use.
Michael Fabricant.
Question 9, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'd like to group questions 9 and 17. The government will introduce a points-based immigration system that works in the interest of the United Kingdom and is fair and prioritises skills that people have to offer wherever they come from.
Fabricant.
Well, I, for one, welcome this, particularly the fact that we'll be able to get the brightest and the best, not only from Europe, but from other nations as well, like the US, Australia and New Zealand and Canada. But in Lichfield, we're a rural constituency, a particularly beautiful one, I might add. And we have a need not just for people with great skills, but also for part-time horticultural workers. What can my right honourable friend do to assure people they will come to the UK?
Well, without wanting to compete with his beautiful rural constituency, I too have one, Mr. Speaker. And of course, in order to take back control, we are effectively bringing in these changes. And with that, I'm doubling the numbers of people that can go through the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Scheme, and more information will be following on that in due course.
Jimmy Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend confirm that such a points-based system will take account of the needs of communities across all regions of the United Kingdom, including my Bridgend constituency in Wales?
I thank my right honourable friend for his question and the applicability of the points-based system to his beautiful Bridgend constituency. And of course, he's absolutely right to raise this. We want the brightest and the best. We want to control immigration, but of course we want to bring that equalisation so that anybody from around the world, not just from the EU, that wants to come to the UK and has the skills to offer will be welcome, and also in Bridgend.
Bill Ribeiro added.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask the Minister to provide some clarification regarding the proposed immigration system. It's been called Australian-styled, but the Minister will be aware that the Australian system is actually a permissive system designed to encourage migration. And as the hostile environment rages on, surely that's not what this government aims to do, raise migration. So will the Minister clarify exactly what this system is and confirm if this government will scrap the net migration target, which was dreamt up without evidence and has never once been met?
Thank the Honourable Lady for her question. Of course, you'll know that the hostile environment, as she called it, dates back to previous governments. The point about the points-based system, Mr. Speaker, is of course that we want a simpler, faster, firmer, better system, one that fulfills our promises to the British people, where we seize that once-in-a-generation opportunity to take back control of our borders and end free movement, which I appreciate members on the opposite side of the House simply do not want. We will restore democratic control of our immigration, and that is effectively what the British people voted for.
Thank you, Leah.
Mr. Speaker, it's really important to remember that it actually was the Labour government that introduced a points-based system, but it's important too to remember that many workers that we need in this country cannot come in under the immigration cap of £30,000. The Home Secretary has looked at this for some professions, but will she widen that to make sure that we get the workers that we need?
I think it's important, Mr. Speaker, before obviously there will be immigration legislation that will come forth before this House in due course. With regards to the labour market and also the skills that this country needs, the decisions made around the points-based system will be based upon the needs and the skills that this country requires. And I think that's incredibly important, so that no member is deceived under that, but also recognises the fact that we do need good people with skills that can come to our economy, but also skills that can enable and facilitate growth in our economy. And also we want to encourage the brightest and the best to come to this country, not just from the EU, but also from outside of the EU.
Dr. Kieran Millen.
Number 10, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will take 10 and 22 together. The government is looking at all aspects of the criminal justice system to importantly ensure that it works for victims, witnesses and the most vulnerable. We all have a part to play in this, Mr. Speaker. This isn't just a Home Office matter. And today, the Cabinet's new Committee on the Criminal Justice System will be meeting to look at how we can absolutely drive better integration across government.
Dr. Kieran Millen.
Thank you. As part of that work, I welcome the review of sentencing that we're undertaking. We need to make sure that sentencing reflects the severity of the crimes. I've run a survey for residents in Crewe and Nantwich to tell me what they think, and they overwhelmingly are backing what we're doing. But what they also tell me is that they agree that the term itself, life sentence, I don't really think is fit for purpose. I don't understand why someone whose loved one has been murdered might hear that the person responsible has been given a life sentence and see them walk out of jail while they're still themselves serving the true life sentence of living with a lost relative.
My honourable friend makes some very valid points about victims and sentences and the criminal justice system. In fact, I had the privilege of meeting some of his constituents when I came to visit his constituency during the election. It is fair to say that the work that we're doing with regards to changes to sentences and working with the criminal justice system will ensure that the sentences will fit the crime, and we can therefore restore public confidence in the criminal justice system.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In the Flint area of my Delling constituency, violence and sexual assaults made up 47% of crimes committed in the second half of last year, and antisocial behaviour was 21%. Yet for all crimes committed across the board, only 7% went to court, 31% are still being investigated, and 55% closed with no action. What can my right honourable friend do to assure my constituents that this government will ensure that offenders are being brought to court in a timely and efficient timeframe?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight those appalling figures and statistics which go to show that victims are not being served and justice is not being given to the victims of those crimes. In terms of what we should do, and we are doing, there is clear uplift, financial uplift now to the CPS. We are pressing and working with the CPS closely to address many of these failings. They are inadequacies and failings within the system. We've got to eradicate these delays and we've got to make sure the perpetrators are brought to justice.
Kent Green.
Speaker, it's not just in the CPS that there are delays and bottlenecks, but the Home Secretary will know that in the court system too there are very significant delays, exacerbated in some cases by the lack of access to legal aid, which means defendants having to represent themselves. Can't you say what discussion she is having with her counterparts in the Ministry of Justice about speeding up the courts process?
No, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right to highlight the issues about access to justice. And of course the work that is taking place and will be taking place through the new Crime and Justice Cabinet Committee, but also the work that I myself am undertaking, in addition with the Ministry of Justice, very much shines a spotlight on this, because we have to support individuals as they go through the legal process, the court systems. And of course the government has announced now a Royal Commission into the criminal justice system where some of these issues will be addressed.
Kevin Brennan.
Mr Speaker, one group of people who often don't have confidence in the criminal justice system are people with autism and their families, who often get caught up in the criminal justice system inappropriately. Will the Home Secretary agree to work with ministers in other departments, perhaps to set up a cross-ministerial working group to ensure that people with autism are not unnecessarily caught up in the criminal justice system?
I thank my honourable friend for his point and his comments. And in fact, the new committee that has been established by the Prime Minister is seeking to do exactly this. We have to look across government. No one department has the answers to any of the solutions and the challenges faced by the system, but also in terms of how we can protect victims and individuals. Cross-government department working is absolutely crucial, and of course working with individuals and people that have experience of this is something that I'm very happy to do.
John Morrissey.
Question 12, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, the Government is determined to stop the terrible exploitation of children and rid our streets of criminal county lines gangs. That's why we're augmenting significant police activity with an extra 25 million of targeted investment across the next 2 years to uplift the law enforcement response to county lines and increase the support available to children, young people and their families.
Morrison.
In Beaconsfield, the Thames Valley Police have been working tirelessly to protect and prevent child exploitation, particularly from county lines. Could you tell us and update the House on what preventative tools can the police use to protect children and young people at risk of being criminally exploited through the county lines network?
Well, Mr Speaker, one of the most significant deterrents that we think will be available to us will be differential sentencing. It is already the case that a judge, on giving a sentence to somebody who's involved in county lines, can take into account culpability factors such as the use of children. But I know my honourable friend will be pleased to hear that the Sentencing Council is currently reviewing those guidelines, and we hope and believe that the most severe penalties will be meted out to those who exploit children in this way.
Caroline Harris.
Speaker, with no statutory definition of child criminal exploitation, different safeguarding agencies and police forces understand the risks differently, but county lines exploitation is everywhere. In order to comply with Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary's recommendation that we need a unified definition in law of child criminal exploitation, when can we expect such an announcement so that we are truly safeguarding these child victims?
Mr Speaker, the coordination of the effort across government and indeed all the arms of government, local government included, will be one of the primary tasks of the new Cabinet Committee that's been established by my right honourable friend the Prime Minister. She is quite right that dealing with this phenomenon, which spans force and local authority boundaries, is one which will take a united and concerted approach, and we'll be doing so over the next few weeks.
Suella Brabham.
to Hampshire Police, every town in our county has been targeted by County Lions drugs gang, and in Fareham we had some recent arrests of drug dealers. Will the Minister reassure me that Fareham won't get overlooked in the allocation of police officers as part of this new recruitment wave?
Well, Mr. Speaker, in her usual manner, my honourable friend is fighting hard for resources for her constituency, and I don't blame her for doing so. But as she knows, the allocation of police officers in a specific force area, not least new police officers, is a matter for the Chief Constable. However, as a Hampshire MP myself, with a town which has also been preyed upon by County Lions drugs dealers, she can be assured that it is the front of my mind as to how we as a county and indeed a country can combat this scourge.
Karen McCarthy.
The Minister what discussions he is having with other departments about what we do when young people are being identified as having been caught up in county lines. It's very important that, in some cases at least, they're treated as victims, but that means getting them away from the scenes of where they're vulnerable. And many times they're not being found until they present at hospital because they've been stabbed. What are we doing about rehousing them or finding them a safe place to go so they don't get caught back up in the gangs again?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said in answer to an earlier question, coordination of the effort against county lines, both in terms of enforcement and intervention, and then indeed rescuing young people who are involved in it, will take a huge amount of effort. And the Cabinet Committee, which the Prime Minister has drawn together, will be looking specifically at this. She will be pleased to know, however, the Cabinet Office has been leading on cross-government work, looking at what more we can do to make sure that we deal with this problem.
Stuart Anderson.
Question 16, Mr. Speaker.
The landmark domestic abuse bill was announced alongside the Queen's speech on the 19th of December last year. The bill and accompanying non-legislative package will protect and support victims of domestic abuse across England and Wales and bring perpetrators to justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the West Midlands, there were over 60,000 domestic abuse-related incidents and crimes recorded by the police in the year ending March 2019. Could I request the Minister to ensure that in the forthcoming domestic abuse bill that these victims and their children who, as a result of their ordeal, have been made homeless are prioritised during the allocation of safe and permanent housing for victims of domestic abuse in Wolverhampton and across the country?
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point, and the Government is committed to supporting domestic abuse victims and their children. Statutory guidance already makes clear that councils should consider giving additional preference for social housing to those who are homeless and require urgent rehousing as a result of domestic abuse, and strongly encourages all councils to give appropriate priority to victims and their families who have escaped abuse and are being accommodated in a refuge or other temporary accommodation.
Gerald Murray.
Question 18, please, sir.
Mr. Speaker, we are determined to tackle the scourge of knife crime. We're recruiting 20,000 more police officers, increasing police funding, making it easier for the police to use stop and search, and ensuring that more perpetrators go to prison for longer. We've legislated through the Offensive Weapons Act and knife crime prevention orders to help take more knives off the street, and are also introducing the Serious Violence Bill, which will put a duty on police, councils and health authorities to prevent and reduce serious violence.
Sean Murray.
Last month, a young man tragically lost his life in Liscod, having been stabbed. What action is being taken to get knives off our streets in towns and rural areas?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I first of all offer my condolences to the family of the bereaved? It's a terrible event to happen and I know it will have shocked everybody in the town. Happily, I understand an investigation is ongoing, an arrest has been made, and we wait the outcome of that investigation. As the Honourable Lady will know, because she's fought hard for resources for her constituency, Devon and Cornwall Police will be receiving more funding next year, and they will be able to recruit 141 additional officers in the first year as part of the 20,000 police officer uplift, and I hope they will be put to good use preventing exactly this sort of incident.
Questions to David Abbott.
Topical number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, last week we were shocked and appalled by another terror attack on the streets of London. I'd like to pay tribute to our brave police and emergency services who responded immediately. It is our duty to keep the people and the public safe, and it's only right that this government is now bringing forward emergency legislation to put a stop to these terrorist offenders being automatically released early with no check or review. Mr. Speaker, since I last addressed this House, Britain has made history in leaving the European Union, delivering on our promise to the British people. This is the dawn of a bright new future for our country. And with that, I'm also delighted, Mr. Speaker, to announce that there have been 3 million applications to our hugely successful EUSS scheme, and this will embrace an exciting chapter in our new history together.
Thank my right honourable friend for her response. Could she advise what steps she's taking to attract highly skilled scientists and engineers to come and work in our country and contribute to our successful future?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right to point about the fact that we are now introducing, through our points-based system, new routes to attract the brightest and the best, people with skills, fast-track immigration scheme facilitating entry to the UK for more scientists, researchers and mathematicians. This is just the first phase, Mr. Speaker, of our reforms to send the signal that the UK intends to remain at the forefront of research and innovation.
Does the Home Secretary appreciate the widespread concern about the Jamaican deportation flight due tomorrow? Is the Home Secretary aware that Stephen Shaw, in his review of detention, suggested we should not be deporting people who came here as children, but many of the proposed deportees came here as children and have no memory of Jamaica? Does the Home Secretary accept that these deportations constitute double jeopardy because the persons have already served an appropriate sentence for their crime? And is the Home Secretary aware that over 170 members of Parliament from all political parties have written to the Prime Minister calling for this deportation flight to be halted?
I'll say to the Right Honourable Lady, and I'm sure that she is aware of this, that under the UK Borders Act 2007, a deportation order must be made in respect of foreign criminal activity sentences for a period of 12 months or more imprisoned. And therefore, every person on this flight has been convicted of a serious offence and received a custodial sentences of 12 months or more, which means that under the Act, introduced by the Labour government in 2007, Mr. Speaker, a deportation order must be made.
Virginia Cross, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have received significant online abuse, intimidation and threats. I believe this kind of abuse on social media directed at me and others is simply unacceptable. It puts off people from making a difference in public life. I've had considerable online support from many of my honest Morn constituents, and for this I would like to show my appreciation. What is the government doing to protect people who want to stand for public office?
Can I thank my honourable friend for shining a spotlight and highlighting some of the most corrosive and abusive behaviours that people in public office, public servants, witness and experience online. That is simply unacceptable. But to answer her questions, of course, the government is bringing forward the Online Harms White Paper. That is coming forward where we are absolutely going to tackle these corrosive behaviours, pull them off online, and also introduce the right kind of regulatory regime so that that kind of hatred cannot carry on online.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Friday, the Deputy Chair of the local Conservative Association was jailed for 9 weeks for menacing communications, including threats against me. I'm already organising her to be hurt. Amazing what crackheads will do for £100. I'm going to get her beat up. The chair of the local association has today written to me expressing regrets and apologies for what he describes as the grave and unacceptable actions of their member who has since been expelled. And I welcome that letter and that support. But it is a concern to me that there has been thus far no similar condemnation or sense of regret expressed by the National Party. And a letter to me from the National Chair in response to this issue, the strongest it said was, intimidating behaviour has no place in our politics. I'm disappointed too that the neighbouring MP chose to give a very positive character reference for this individual without contacting me first, and I have raised that with her directly. I know she was unable to be in the chamber today. And I still am concerned that although I raised this case with senior members of the National Party, this individual was still able to be at the general election count after he had been summoned. Can I ask the Home Secretary, therefore, to condemn these threats in the strongest terms, to look into her party's response, and also to show leadership on this by urging all political parties to come together and draw up a new joint code of conduct against intimidation, because violent threats must have no place in politics from all parties.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady for presenting to the House today the horrors of what she has endured, and for making the case very strongly and robustly that there is no place in society or in public life for threats and intimidation. Let me, Mr. Speaker, say this right now on the floor of the House, that is categorically unacceptable and wrong. There is no place for intimidation at all in public life. In terms of the National Party response, she can take it from me right now that I am hugely apologetic for what she has had to put up with. That is simply unacceptable, and that is also something that we should all be mindful of and look into. As representatives of major political parties, none of this should be tolerated. I know that the Right Honourable Lady made a reference to my honourable colleague in the neighbouring constituency, and my understanding is that her comments were in support very much of giving the individual, getting the individual some help and support that that individual needed in terms of access to mental health. However, Mr. Speaker, I see that the lady on the opposite benches is chuckling away. This is a very serious matter, and actually this is not a laughing matter. And I think it's fair to say, Mr. Speaker, the insincerity sits with the honourable lady that's just made that remark. The fact of the matter is, it is right that we come together. Yes, we will see. And I think it's a fact that obviously it's this government that is trying to deal with these types of issues. You've already heard me speak about dealing with online harms, dealing with trolling, calling this unacceptable. I am absolutely sincere in my remarks, Mr. Speaker, and I'm so sorry. And actually, I think it's quite shameful that the lady on the opposite benches is herself being quite insincere in the case that I'm putting forward.
Brown. My constituency of South Cambridgeshire has one of the fastest growing populations of any constituency in the country, partly because it's such a wonderful place to live. Police numbers, which are partly based on lagging population figures, have not kept pace. Can my right honourable friend tell me what the government is doing to increase police numbers in Cambridgeshire?
Mr. Speaker, we provided up to £10.6 million more of funding, which will allow the Police and Crime Commissioner to recruit another 64 police officers for the county. That's the first instalment on the share of Cambridgeshire will get of the 20,000 police officers. But I do hope that the good people of Cambridgeshire will reciprocate by electing a very good Police and Crime Commissioner in May.
Who was next? Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When will her department announce the immigration status of EU students who are due to start courses in 2021?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We will shortly confirm our policy on migration, and of course we will continue to have the discussions across government with the European Union to determine the future status here in this country.
David Simmons.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree with me that Neighbourhood Watch is a vital asset to the detection of crime? And will she join me in putting pressure on the Mayor of London to continue to support OWL, the online system used by more than 100,000 London Neighbourhood Watch members that secured more than 1,200 hours' worth of sentences for criminals in my council ward in my constituency alone?
Well done. Mr. Speaker, I'm more than happy to endorse the remarks of the honourable gentleman who's been a champion for his part of London long before his time in this House. He's quite right about having high expectations of the Mayor of London, who sadly, thus far in his term as Mayor, has disappointed in as far as his effort on crime is concerned.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Glasgow's had plans for a medical supervised drug consumption room since 2016, and the evidence worldwide points to the efficacy of these rooms. So when the UK Government holds its drug summit in Glasgow later on this month, will it act on the evidence and bring solutions for urgent change, or will it be more of the same from the Government?
Mr Speaker, I'm sure that the issue of drug consumption will appear in the discussion in the drug summit, but I'll repeat to the Honourable Lady what I have said at the Scottish Affairs Select Committee on this matter. The obsession of the SNP on drug consumption is a distraction from the major effort that can be put, and the evidence across the world is irrefutable that treatment is by far and away the best way to prevent drug deaths, and that it's no surprise that they should seek to distract, not least since the SNP government has cut drug treatment funds in Scotland over the last few years.
Over the weekend, a very large number of illegal migrants were detained trying to cross the Channel. Now, last summer, the Prime Minister warned migrants crossing the Channel that the United Kingdom will, quote, send you back. However, I read that few of these migrants are actually sent back because they have claims for asylum. But surely, if you leave a perfectly safe country like France and illegally try and enter our country, you should not be able to claim asylum. So will the Home Office get a grip and send these people back to stop this illegal trade?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I share my honourable friend's concerns, and we're very clear that people should make their asylum claim in the first safe country they reach, and we work under the Dublin regulation to do so, and are continuing to discuss our future participation in terms of post-Brexit, or in terms of future agreement, but we will be tackling this because we want to end the scourge that is trafficking and puts so many lives at risk.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In the West Midlands, violent crime is up 27%. The homicide rate is rising, and in Birmingham, drug crime is at a 6-year high. The Home Secretary admitted last week that some communities have been, and I quote, neglected and left behind. Would she accept, given the rises in violent and drug crime in Birmingham, that her comments include my city, and will her department finally step up to the plate and do something about it?
Well, I had the recent privilege of visiting the West Midlands literally 2 weeks ago and participating in an early morning drugs raid. And what I would say is the scourge of serious violence and crime is absolutely one that we have to deal with. This government is fully committed to that. This government is providing all the necessary resources, and the resources, the money, the equipment and the powers to the police to absolutely get on top of this.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Just this weekend, I received a report of masked intruders on a farm in my constituency. Could my right honourable friend update the House on what is being done to tackle intimidation of farmers and rural crime, such as fly tipping and theft, and also reassure my constituents that preventing and prosecuting rural crime will be a focus of this government?
I'd like to reassure the Honourable Lady that rural crime absolutely features amongst all crimes and criminality, which is totally unacceptable and blights communities. And she will know, as will all members of this House who are representing rural communities, whether it's fly tipping, organised crime that is related to waste crime in particular, has to be pursued. And that is something that we are currently working on through our serious organised crime strategy, but also working across government on.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. How many EU citizens who've been living here for more than 5 years, entirely legally, and have applied for settled status, have been given only pre-settled status?
I would say to the Honourable Lady, pre-settled status is granted to people who have not been in the country 5 years. By definition, an EU citizen who has been living in the country for 5 years or more and can evidence that will be granted full settled status. Just for clarity, I think in the last set of official figures, only 5 people have been refused status, all of which were on the grounds of criminality.
To Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. When a secular psychopath threatens to run amok and kill indiscriminately, we treat him as criminally insane and detain him indefinitely in high-security psychiatric units. Why do we not do the same for a religious psychopath who threatens to do exactly the same thing?
Well, my honourable friend raises some very important points, and of course Many of these issues, and in fact the points that he's referring to, will be addressed by the government when we come forward, obviously with emergency legislation tomorrow, but also the forthcoming counter-terrorism bill, which very much looks at the appropriate sentences for people that are seeking to do a great deal of harm to our country.
I just want to reassure the House that, in fairness to the Home Secretary and myself, we take very seriously threats against MPs and candidates during the last election, so much so we were constantly in touch to make sure that support was being given. That support will continue for all MPs, and please, if there is a threat to any MP, make sure that you report it in. So as I say, the House and I and the Home Secretary will ensure your safety comes first. So please do not shy away from reporting any incidents. John Church.
For taking this point of order, which I'll keep brief. In 2017, before the general election in that year, Amnesty International carried out research into abuse against female MPs. The result was that the Right Honourable Lady, my honourable friend, for the member for Hackney and Stoke Newington, was the most abused female MP in the United Kingdom by a country mile. I was the second most abused female MP in the UK, although very far behind my Right Honourable friend, who's had a lot to put up with. That was a perspective from which I made my comments in exasperation during the last exchange. So, Mr Speaker, I simply want to put on the record that that was the context in which I made my comments, and to say that the level of abuse which I have continued to receive has taken its toll on me, my girlfriend, my family and my friends, and I really do hope the government is going to tackle it in this session.
Can I say, and I want to reassure Honourable Lady, that there should be nobody having to suffer abuse in the way that we've seen, and I would say there are many other MPs as well. What I want to do is make sure that doesn't happen, and I want to try and ensure that your safety, as I say, please, if you are getting abuse, we will ensure that the House supports you, and we will take people to court. I have done a witness statement on behalf of every MP when we go to court, so my witness statement will be used to ensure you have the backup and to take some of that threat away from you. Right, we're now, thank you. We're now going to go.